Right, Gavin Mkhabela, property investment strategist, joins us to discuss this further. Very good evening to you, sir. Thank you so very much for joining us on SABC News.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're most welcome, sir. All right, do you think that it's a good idea for the private sector coming in on board to invest in government, almost like saving the government from itself and investing in government properties? Do you believe that's the way to go?
Absolutely. I think, when we talk about the government and private sector, collaborations, especially in times like these where we find, the economy that is distressed. And of course, there's a lot of frustrations, when it comes to from the private sector wanting to play a role. But there's a lot of red tapes, that we find in the municipal level. So, I really welcome anything that has to do with partnerships that really comes from the government.
Yeah.
And of course, as private investors, we also, looking to partner with the government in that manner to just change the economy, so to speak. So definitely welcomed.
Is there a possibility of government finding itself in a situation where they're being bulldozed or, for lack of a better word, bullied by the private sector when engaging in such business with the private sector in their own properties?
Look, I think at the end of the day, it's all about the engagement. If there is proper engagement from both spheres, then I don't see any problem, because bulldozing can come either way, from the government side, even from the private side. But if there is proper consultations in terms of, understanding what are the shortcomings, because if you look at, for example, as, from the private sector, even if as a private investor, when you now have to deal with government in many of these situations, whether it's to go, to apply for rezoning and all those kind of things, it can be a very difficult process. And I think one of the issues is really where you find there's a lot of departments, there's a lot of, people that one has to deal with, and there is no synergy around these departments as well, which can be very frustrating. And remember that at the end of the day, if now, you're applying and it takes time, it can be costly as well. And I think that's where we also find the private sector, deciding not to really play a part, because at the end of the day, there is no willingness at times when it comes to dealing with government, around a lot of issues within the property sector. So I think it's all about engagement, and I'm glad that we are seeing a lot of, in Bezos, in that manner, which really helps.
Yeah. Mr. Mkhabela, when you talk about proper engagement, I'm automatically thinking about, the sort of agreements and having, I assume you being a property investment strategist, that you've been involved in quite a few of these sort of agreements, and you've seen these sort of tight contracts in place, when we have these sort of agreements in place. What sort of contract would you be looking at here? And I mean, when we're talking about the tightness of that particular contract, I mean, what would you be imagining to be, really the cornerstone of what would make this sort of relationship and agreement or proper engagement work, as you say?
Look, I think it differs, because if we talk about the property sector in general, there's a number of layers involved, so you have the commercial side, you have the residential side. So it also depends in terms of when one, engages with the government, what are they engaging on? Is it from a leasing? Is it from, so it really depends. But I think when I talk about the engagement, I'm talking about from a large scale where when we have like the minister coming in and say, look, we have this situation, there is this conferences, the Imbizos that we currently having, it's all about highlighting really what are the issues. And I think a lot of the issues is around, it comes down to the municipal level where, when we're dealing, for example, you put in the plans, what is the turnaround time from that perspective? And the different departments and who now needs to be able to, sign off of certain things, that becomes really frustrating a lot of times. Yeah. So it really just would depend. But I think the bottom line that we really trying to say, especially from a private sector perspective, is that we're looking for the government that is will be effective and efficient around, when, there's engagement of, whether it's rezoning, whether it's plans, but everything needs to work accordingly. And there needs to be willingness from those people that are in charge from the government's departments to be able to help us and make sure that the processes around different aspects of property engagement within the, whether it's from the municipal level, it's very smooth and sufficient from that point on.
I'm glad you brought up, the topic of, residential, if we're talking about, and I want to kind of focus on that for a little bit. When we're talking about, residential property and development, I mean, why could the government not do it on their own? I mean, given the fact that, we're hearing about a lot of housing backlogs, people without homes, could the government not use these properties that they are worried could end up being, slum areas? Could they not use that, as a base for creating these sort of residential places for people who aren't able to? I mean, the fact that we've got, somewhat empty buildings and so forth is problematic that are owned by the government. Surely they themselves could do this without having to engage the private sector that much.
I think there might also be an issue of capacity, and skills development as well. Because, if you look at, let's talk about COVID. I think COVID was a perfect example of what can happen when people put heads together. Because we then saw a lot of, the commercial guys starting to now doing a lot of conversion from commercial into the residential space. But it all boils down to, obviously the willingness to do that, but also just the skills that is involved from that perspective. Because I feel that there is some kind of a deficit when it comes to, especially from, the government side, the municipal side, where you also have maybe people that are in key areas that don't necessarily have the necessary skills. So that's where now you find that we normally need to now rope in the private sector to come in and basically save the day, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but there needs to be some kind of a balance where we can work together, because there's always room for everybody to sit together and say, but how do we, turn around the situation? Because it's not necessarily only from the residential side of things, but we can look at other things as well, like warehousing. We need manufacturing in this country. So some of these buildings can come through. In the townships, there is a lot of, young people that are idling. So some of these buildings can come in from a skills development. So there's tons and tons of things that can happen. But it's really all boils down to say, is the door open enough, for everybody to sit down on the table and have a discussion.
All right. We appreciate your time and insightful views there. That's, of course, Gavin Mkhabela, property investment strategist, joining us there. Thank you very much to you, sir.